Hello and welcome to the Berean Bookclub podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us. So we are back for part 2 of our discussion on Strange New World by Carl Trueman. We wanted to do it over one session, but there's just too much to say. So we broke it into 2 parts, hopefully, and to see if that can just aid us so we don't bunch too much into one episode. It's a lot of information. It's actually a lot to process and to think. And so after you've listened to part 1, it will be really helpful for you to just reflect a bit of how have you seen this play out in your own life, and the same here in part 2 as we hopefully conclude the narrative and see where there's some hope for us. So do you want to maybe give us a summary of part 1?
Okay, summary of part 1. Let's start with human nature very quickly. Human nature becomes something which is bad, which is corrupted, and not something that we look to for authority and who we are, how we function, how the world works. We move away from external authorities telling us how the world works and how we work. And the shift that happens is not just a move away from these external authorities, but a move inward to the psychologized self, to put it that way, where we are who we feel we are, and we express that as individuals, and that has primary authority over and above these external things.
The next step is the sexualizing of psychology. And so how we understand psychology primarily in sexual categories. And then the last move that he's gonna talk about is how then sex has been politicized. And so that is the whole shift, how we're gonna get to our day and age and understand the world around us. And so the main thinkers we're going to be looking at, I mean, there's so much to talk about in this book, but just quickly, for the sexualizing of this psychology, we're going to be looking at Freud and the way in which Freud understood sexual pleasure. And then after that, we're going to see how not only does Freud kind of lead to the psychologizing of sex, but then it automatically becomes a political issue. And this is expressed most clearly by Wilhelm Reich and his thinking. So those are the 2 major thinkers we're going to be talking about a bit. And then we'll end with kind of how this leads to the sexual revolution, our day and age, and how to better engage with it. So just like starting off, I'm gonna quote Trueman here as he speaks about Freud. For Freud, he says, if the fundamental form of human happiness is the genital pleasure derived from sex, then we can conclude that for Freud, human nature is at its deepest level sexual, and that human beings are therefore defined in a basic way by their sexual desires. That is how Freud understood the world, primarily in a sexual way, finding happiness in our sexual fulfillment. We then add to the fact that for Freud, he also sees sexual desire as existing from infancy. The point is further reinforced. Our identities as human beings are, in a very important sense, fundamentally defined by our sexual desires. Okay, so Freud is the first guy to give voice in any kind of like academic kind of place to these kind of thinkings, where he understands true happiness comes from being sexually fulfilled. That is where you find true happiness. That is at the core. The happiness psychological term is at its kind of the end goal of pure happiness is when you have sexual pleasure. And so the whole goal of human existence is to find that like happiness, as Freud would put it. So that's what he kind of like does, although Freud's theories have been rejected by many psychologists and not used anymore, or even kind of beneficial for understanding us as human beings, the ideas live on. And we see that again, the way in which we express our sexual identities, as saying that, like, I'm heterosexual, that is who I am. The same that we see again with I'm homosexual, I'm bisexual. Just those terms in and of themselves describe how closely they are linked to our identities in our day and age. And Freud is kind of the first guy that brings that up. For Freud, though, there's a problem with civilization. So he writes a book that then goes on to say that, like, if we are all free to express ourselves sexually as we desire, this will lead to absolute chaos. This will lead to the strong male dominating everyone for his sexual pleasure. And that's a world that no one wants to live in. And so Freud writes this book, Civilization and Its Discontent, where he basically makes the argument that civilization can't function. There can't be any sort of civilization if we all just seek our ultimate happiness. So he doesn't have this utopian vision that this is going to come true. Rather, he has a more pessimistic view that we now impose morality for us to function together as a society. So we have to impose some sort of morality for us to be able to treat one another not just as sexual objects for my own gain. And he kind of feels that will be impossible. And so he bases that morality, again, in a very loose plastic sense, on taste or disgust. And so the world decides the society decides what's disgusting and not pleasing to us, and we base our sexual moral codes based on that. Yeah.
It is maybe just worth just noticing how Freud over here embodies a little bit of the psychologized self. That the primary thing that marks your identity and that kind of rules your life for Freud is ultimately an inward desire
For happiness,
right? It's a sexual desire, yes, but it's fundamentally individual and inward, not something which is external, which was part one. That's that's where the world had ended up, to put it that way. And so Freud coloring in the picture here it's very characteristic of that move. You see that happening
very clearly.
My identity, who I am, it is based on an inward desire, not an external authority at all. And these external authorities for Freud only are very pragmatic. They form a very particular function.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing for Freud. Freud is not anti-religion per se, because he's like, hey, religion gives us a sort of morality that allows us to live together, because it bases its kind of, there's a reason for that morality to exist. We can live together. If everyone's like religious, although he thinks it's like a childish view to take and not true at all, it at least allows us to be civilized. But the reality that's happened here is the sexual self has become the primary source of identity for Freud and in the thinking, and that then automatically must become political, because when any sexual codes that you enforce, whether it's the state, whether it's the church, whether it's anything that enforces a certain set of sexual codes to live by, those who have the inner design to live outside of those sexual codes are being oppressed by these sexual codes, and therefore those sexual codes become where the political argument is, because in setting sexual codes or moral codes kind of around sexuality, you are denying someone's happiness, their inner psychological happiness, which is their identity. And so this becomes like the place where it's really all thought about. Trueman says there's such a development was hardly surprising once the thinking of Freud took hold. If we are at root defined in large part by our sexual desires, if sexual desire or orientation, as we now say, is who we are, then sex must be political, because rules governing sexual behavior are rules that govern what is and what is not considered by society to be legitimate as an identity. Okay, so without even going to any other thinkers, like just with Freud's formulation of how we understand our identity, we must see that the end goal here is political liberation from societal sexual codes. Otherwise, we are denying people's inner psychological happiness. And so you know there's gonna come a clash here with any sort of sexual moral codes that get imposed. And that's where the next thinker really comes to play. Freud was way more pessimistic. That's why he wrote his book, Civilization and His Discontent. He doesn't think we can get there. Wilhelm Reich, who was a student of Freud, the next guy Trueman picks up on, he then, with his Marxist kind of understanding of history and the way in which history works, shifts this thinking. So instead of being pessimistic, he's overly optimistic that we can get to a place where everyone expresses this inner sexual desire and finds that happiness. The only problem we have right now is there are certain groups that are oppressing those who want to kind of build that, to make that liberation possible. And so he's got this utopian view of the future where it's possible for us all to live in this place where we experience sexual liberation and fulfillment. And he then kind of turns its head to kind of, who is it then that is opposing these sexual, who are creating these sexual nodes and opposing this kind of liberation for us in the future. And that's where it really turns to the external sources of authority that have imposed any moral codes. The state, the church is like right, and the family. All three those institutions functioned with clear understanding of what it means to live together, and sexual codes that kind of like governed that. So he says here, the point is clear. Sexual codes must be shattered if human beings are to be truly free. Those things that inhibit the free sexual expression, even of young children, are oppressive and prevent individuals from truly being themselves. Of course, the question then immediately rises, who is going to facilitate this revolution in sexual codes if the family and later the church have a vested interest in maintaining the old oppressive standards of behavior? The answer lies in the last sentence of the above quotation. Society will do so by promoting the sexual freedom and dealing severely with those who oppose it. In short, sex must become a pressing political issue in which the state takes a proactive interest. And that's the foundation that he then kind of like Trueman gives us. He says, now we're at the place where sex has been politicized, and not only like one of the things that we talk about, a pressing issue, because it denies fundamentally people's identities.
So he's saying something's got to bring this change about. Something's got to free us from these societal sexual codes. Something's got to get rid of them. The family's not going to do that, because the family almost relies on some of those codes and presuppositions to exist as a family.
Yes.
Religious institutions aren't going to do that because they hold to traditional moral sexual codes. And so it automatically becomes political. The state ends up being the one that's got to do that. And very suddenly you start to understand why LGBTQ plus movement has been such a political thing over the last while. And we've heard stories crop up everywhere over the last number of years. And these aren't merely private conversations that are happening, but these are battles being fought in the high courts.
Yeah. The Boy Scouts, the cake bakers, all the different places. The real battle, the culture war, if you want to put it that way, is happening there where sexual identity is being regulated, and how the state then is fighting against that. So there's where the battles are really fought. Yeah. We can see, this is the last quote just on this section. We can see that once identity is psychologized, anything that is seen to have a negative impact upon someone's psychological identity can potentially come to be seen as harmful, even as a weapon that does serious damage. This includes those words and ideas that stand over and against those identities that society chooses to sanction. This has clear implications for traditional freedoms of religion and speech. And here, again, that summarizes our day and age so clearly. The way in which kind of violence has moved from being physical violence to primarily almost being understood as psychological. And so if you disagree with me, this is not even on something big. If you disagree with me on something, I take that and I internalize it, and I can shift that to mean that you're violent towards me. And that justifies a whole lot of other actions that the state can impose on you then, because you've been violent towards me. And that's a little bit of what we see, all the riots and everything happening at campuses because of certain speakers that want to go speaking specifically here about the US. It's almost like it's this spiral of violence that we start to see kind of like coming up again and again, where someone's views are seen as so oppressive that it can be met with violence as to kind of like stop it, which is a bit of a scary thought for us, going forward. Something to be looked up from.
Because a disagreement with someone, given this narrative, given the story, a disagreement with someone, particularly a disagreement about someone's expressed identity,
yes,
as an individual, is not a disagreement about something neutral all of a sudden. It's not a disagreement about a standard of order or a human nature or the way things are. It becomes instantly deeply personal.
Yeah.
Because authority is
internal.
It's
You're
personal.
right.
It's psychological.
It's a denial of my dignity.
Yes.
And so there's a clash that's going to happen. And I think that's where we are, just as we come to kind of the end of our discussion. The church has an external authority. God has spoken. He sent his son to live his life, to die on the cross, resurrected, raised, and then he gave us his word and his spirit. We have an authority that is external, outside of us. And that authority upholds certain values. It's just, that's the way in which God has spoken. There are certain views on sex and sexuality that God has spoken. There's certain views on marriage that God has spoken. And we see here that this is where we're going to really see the clash happening. These views can't exist together. It's politicized. This is like one or the other one, and it's going to be a fight kind of till one of them kind of like rules, if you understand what I'm saying. And I think that's why we see all the places around us. This is becoming the kind of the discussions that we are part of and have to engage with, and to be aware of the world that we live in, to be aware of what God has said and has revealed, I think is the first step to helping us to, one, engage better with our brothers and sisters in the church, how we can build one another up, how we can kind of stand up for gospel truth and recognize what's at stake if we lose some of the basic fundamental understandings of what it means to be human. But then also to engage with the culture around us, to ask these kinds of questions, like where does this morality come from? Is the idea of consent enough? in our day and age to kind of govern sexual moral codes. He makes the point, although that is what we want, the world wants to be able to enforce that, it still can't kind of, that's not good enough when it comes to pedophilia and how that works. And so the plastic morality of the world is something to be engaged and to talk through with the people out there. Yeah. Maybe as we kind of end our discussion, do you think there's any hope for us, or where do you think we turn to from here?
Yeah, I mean, we had said this from the get-go as well, that Trueman's not trying to offer any answers. He's just trying to lay out the landscape, and I think that's good. We should probably be slow to offer answers as well. I certainly don't have any. I can only speak from personal experience, what has struck me from spending some time thinking through these things and reading this book. And it's perhaps more of an internal church application than how we engage with the world. But the identity thing it really struck me. How a shift has happened to moving away from external things forming and shaping us, and rather to us kind of forming and shaping ourselves and expressing ourselves to be these authentic individuals. What struck me about seeing this in my own heart is how the gospel offers an alternative. The gospel offers a change through God's Spirit into the image of Christ, something external to us, changing us, not us being self-made. Now, there's a certain rest there, that kind of we're not up to kind of making ourselves. We don't need to feel the pressure to be self-made. That's in the hands of Christ. But there's a bit of a challenge there, which goes against my grain, as I've already mentioned, that Christ wants to change, right? He saves us to something, and he conforms us into the image of his Son, and that's for our good. That's for our good and for our better. And so I think what's been an encouragement to me and a challenge to me is that God's the one who changes us, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
it's a good thing to be conformed to the image of Christ, and we should want that.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke about it a little bit earlier, but the Christian call to die to oneself is very much in opposition to expressive individualism, let alone like the sexualized version of that. And I think that's the thing that has struck me as well. It's like God has called us to be truly human. He knows what it means to flourish. He's the one that has created us. And he's ultimately showed us that in his Son, Jesus, who came to die for us. And so our call to become like Christ, as you mentioned, is not a call to kind of like less freedom. It is the call to true freedom. It is a call to true happiness. And that happiness is not just like an external happiness that one day will be in heaven, but it is a true internal reality as well. It is a fully human experience, both real life here, but also psychologically. I know my Lord and Savior, his Spirit dwells in me. And so just like the Psalms and Augustine and even Jonathan Edwards that Trueman mentioned, the internal dimension of who we are is not to be sacrificed as we become Christians. It's actually to be realized as we recognize who we are in Christ and dwell on that a lot. And so I think for me, that's something that has just struck me, although it seems so against kind of like true happiness, but the real happiness comes from actually submitting to our Creator and his ways of living, instead of seeking to be God myself. And the the freedom, and then ultimately the despair that comes from that.
So perhaps just a note, if anyone does choose to pick up this book and read it for themselves, this is obviously a condensed, more accessible version of the original work, which is quite a bit longer and quite a bit more intricate. But even the condensed work, it can feel a little bit heavy. He does speak through like a lot of things with different philosophers and certain like philosophical terms and even it was even a tricky read for me. Even the condensed version, I listened to certain chapters quite a few times, and even this morning, re-listening to some stuff, you notice things every time, new things every time. If this is a book that you want to pick up and read, and you start reading and you feel like, I'm hating this, just push on. Just push on to the end. It will start falling into place, even if you don't understand what's going on as he's working through the chapters and saying certain things. By the time that he gets to the end of the book and he starts pulling some of those strings together, it will make much more sense. And so my final note is just one of encouragement. If you do pick up this book, which I really do encourage you to do, push on. It will be worth it in the end.
Lekker. So there we go. Part 2, Strange New World, is done and dusted. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We hope you were greatly encouraged by it and that it was beneficial for you. We got quite a lot of stuff going on, but we got our book list is on the website, so you can go to btistellenbosch.com, and there you'll see under podcast the Berean Bookclub. There you can get our book list for this year. We got some exciting books coming that we're going to be reading. Our next book is called The Thrill of Orthodoxy by Trevin Wax. And I actually chose that book specifically because of what we learned here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What I realized was that we as Christians need to understand or actually know deeply what this external authority has actually spoken. So God has spoken. He's revealed certain things to us. And if we are going to rally together in this day and age that's going to be so kind of contentious about a lot of stuff, it's good for us to figure out what is essential and what is peripheral, and figure those things out. And so The Thrill of Orthodoxy is actually a book about, I've started to listen to it, and it's like it picks up on so much of the expressive individualism and creating oneself to rather finding oneself in a story that's already been revealed. So The Thrill of Orthodoxy by Trevin Wax, you can go and listen to that at Script. It's a great little read, and that's what we're going to be discussing next month. So till then, grace and peace. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Berean Bookclub podcast. We'd love for you to head over to your podcasting app and give us a review and subscribe to the podcast. It will help us so much. This podcast was brought to you by BTI Stellenbosch. BTI Stellenbosch exists to bring theology to the church. If you want to find out more information, you can head over to btistellenbosch.com. Until next time.